John in Missouri. Welcome to the show, John.
Jim and Jmike, how you doing?
Good. Pretty good.
The reason I'm calling today is...
yeah. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
The question for the question proposed for the show caught my interest because it's something that I've struggled with for a long, long time, and it's the reasonableness of presupposing a God. Mm-hmm. And is it reasonable to do so? And I think that it is reasonable because without a source of information, the way we do look for information, the way we do look for answers, we look, and in the process of not finding answers, then we have to kind of infer what we're seeing and what's going on. In a modern day, in modern times, it's impossible to presuppose a God because there's so much information that we're raised around, that we're brought up in, that even when we're brought up within a specific religion, we don't get the opportunity to presuppose, but yet we still have the innate sensation that because we can sense things we can't feel, and we can infer things that we can't define, that we liken that to supernatural. We liken that to a creator or whatever. But,
okay, how are you using the word presuppose? Let me make sure we're talking about the same thing, because it sounds like you could be using it in a couple of different ways. So when I say presuppose a God, what do you interpret that to mean?
I'm interpreting that to mean that based on whatever information that has brought me to that point where I'm asking myself that I'm assuming that it must be, without having to have any information to support it, or without having any real reason to believe it.
Right. So is believing things without a reason rational?
Rational is a different thing. Reasonable is what we're talking about. It's not rational to believe something that you can't investigate and try to pin something down, which is why that's the problem that I had with religion coming out of it, because I wanted to believe. I was raised to believe, right? So that when I had questions that couldn't be asked, it just left me more confused. So I had to find my own answers. But that was based on the presupposition that what I was being told as a child was right.
Right. So is there anything I can't presuppose?
No, I don't know. There's nothing you can't presuppose.
Okay. So I'm not saying how you can consider this to be rational or reasonable to presuppose anything, much less a God. I mean, I could theoretically or hypothetically presuppose you're a cat in a box.
Yes, sir.
But so how is it rational or reasonable to presuppose anything, much less something as important as a God?
Yeah, rationality is something that you can do when you have better information and better tools. The reasonableness of looking for that in the first place, that guide, that thing that brings you to that idea, it's the same reason that we infer supernatural, because we can sense things we can't see. I can look at somebody, for instance, and I can get a good idea of how they're feeling, and to a degree kind of read where their thoughts are, but I don't have to be able to read their mind to do it.
Right, but we know how that actually, we have a number of hypotheses in psychology that actually explain that, most of them having to do with the way that you're brought up and being forced to pay hyper attention to how someone is feeling, because not doing so would cause you, it would set them off and cause negative consequences. So we know how that happens, and we know that sociopaths in particular and some other folks are very, very good at reading emotions. We know that people who fake being telepaths and people who talk to the dead use that kind of body language reading extremely successfully well. So we have a natural explanation for it, for that kind of thing. But isn't it much more reasonable to leave it at I don't know rather than to come up with something you can't prove?
No, that's more rational to do that. That's what you do when you intellectually look at the situation. But until you get to the point where you have the tools to do that with, right? Before you get to the point where you can say, okay, this doesn't make sense, let's investigate why this doesn't make sense. Okay, now I understand that this doesn't make sense to continue believing. But up to that point, the way the human psyche works, the way we're connected with each other, it's not unreasonable to make the presupposition. Rationality, information, and
why isn't it more reasonable to simply to assume I don't know and leave it at that? Why is that not the better answer?
Because we as human beings, we seek answers. We want answers, and if we can't find immediate answers, we will infer our own.
By infer, do you mean make up?
No, we will interpret the information around us to the best of our ability to decipher the information that our brain is receiving from our eyes.
Are we able to infer everything correctly all the time?
No, that's the whole point. You can't infer anything correctly. Inferring anything is going to be incorrect.
So if inferring anything is going to be incorrect, and I think Jmike has some philosophical issues with inferring things, but it seems to me that you're better off just admitting that I can't make an inference to God, and if I have something that I can't explain, to simply say I don't know, than it is to attempt to explain it.
Yeah, you can't just like.
It took me a long time to reach that point.
Yeah, John, it's hard to John, it's hard, real fast though, but it's hard to when you invoke inferences and stuff and logic, and to be reasonable, right? You're going to have some basis of inference rules, right? That's what makes a structure of an argument valid. And the issue is I can infer if the moon is in the sky, it's made of cream cheese, right? But clearly it doesn't. There's no real implication there, right? That inference is just a hot mess, and there's not much different from that. So you can claim an inference, but an inference in virtue of what? Just because you just put A and Z together?
The truth. You can't find the truth from an inference.
But the problem is, John, you've opened up the door now for people, and this is kind of similar to the last call. You've opened up the door for anybody to rival your presupposition with any other presupposition. I mean, what if I was I went out in the woods and smoked a doobie, and naturalism is true, right? I had this revelation, I could even say, or I just had this presupposition. They're the same claim. They're both just entirely based on a whim. There's nothing of substance there, right? I mean, and to say that I had an inference rule because there's the natural world around me, therefore the natural world, without any investigation or proper inference rules that are applied, then it seems to be hot air from my perspective. I don't mean that disrespectfully. It seems to be the same thing if I just blew hot air out my mouth,
Yeah, and I agree, but this is why we have a society, because it's raised within a certain purview, all right? It's raised within a certain preview of what is and what is not. Getting away from that, even when you intellectually understand there's no way that what you're led to believe makes sense, you almost get to the point where you doubt yourself when you pull yourself away from it because of that existing setup that you have.
Sure, John.
May not be the right word, but
yeah, we're gonna. Well, I take a position on experience. It's what I would say is it's incorrigible, right? It's what the idea is going to be is it's held very firmly. I can only have beliefs if I have experience, right? That's going to be kind of baked in. To say it, it's entirely true.
You don't have to have experience to have belief.
Side point. The issue I'm going to say is look, if I can, if you have this idea, right, and you allow yourself to basically make the inference rule from no criterion at all, what stops me from doing the same thing? And then how could either of us be any closer to truth if we have basically, cut our foot off right from the get-go. It just seems strange to me that you would want to defend that view, because you clearly wouldn't agree with my view that's opposite of yours using the same methodology, right?
That's how I get to your view, because that's how I got to your view. It was when I realized that even though it made sense to me individually and to most people who believe it, that is what is true, that it makes sense to them at that time. When you intellectually step aside from that and you realize the intellectual error of presupposing, then it's easier to start making that break away, because that's what I had to do. So it's not unreasonable.
It seems entirely unreasonable, because this is how I view this in my head, and tell me if I'm wrong. Okay, it seems like we have like an equation on the board, and it's like, what's the answer to life? Okay, and we all don't know, and we're all in the classroom. We got Johnny Presup, right? You're doing a Presup thing. We got Jmike, I don't know. Okay, so, and we got Sally Hindu, or we got whatever, right? We can go down the list, and all of them are giving different answers that's going to be correspondent to their worldview. Okay, now you say I presuppose that the answer is 12. Okay, I go to you and I say, well, I tried to work it out. I don't know the answer. I think it might be 5. I don't really know, but I think it might be 5. Sally comes up to you and says, the answer is definitely 11, right? That's going to be correspondent to what they think their worldview is. A lot of these people might be looking at the world and going, I think it's true because of this prophecy, right? They're using an evidentialist approach. When I ask you what your answer is, or when you ask me what my answer is, and I tell you I don't know, or Sally tells you 5, right? You've presupposed 12. You've already just plugged that in. There's nothing that will ever convince you that it's not 12, because you started there, right? Everything follows that you would never be convinced. And that's the problem I have. Is that not accurate?
You're wrong in your judgment. Once you realize that you're wrong in your judgment, then you can start intellectually trying to figure out what the real answer is.
How do you find out if you're wrong if prior you start with this thing that's entirely unjustified, right?
Exactly, and then that's what happens. I mean, that's how somebody who's trying to unbuckle themselves from the fact that they still fear hell, even though they realize the Bible's pretty much crap. That's how they identify that. Because once you realize that this information is not the pathway to truth, then you can start breaking that down. Until that point, until you realize that what you've done is that natural thing that people do is interpret information for themselves. And without good information, and without some way to interpret the information, you're going to make up what you think you see.
John, real fast. John, I got to stop you there, because you're saying interpret the information, but in virtue of what do you interpret the information upon, right? It's filtered through the presupposition.
Without good information,
entirely, it's confirmation bias at like the highest level possible, right? Like you're just anything that would follow through to like you assessing things is going to be in virtue of that premise that you initially bought into. And if you compare that to that presupposition, you're like, well, nothing would ever convince you, right? It couldn't possibly convince you. Okay, so then why hold a random arbitrary presup and defend that view as opposed to the ad infinitum that I could come up with right now?
I'm not suggesting that you maintain the presupposition. I'm saying that it's natural that a person does make a presupposition.
I'm challenging you, John. I'm specifically challenging you. I'm saying I don't buy into the idea that once you start with this, like I'm okay with axiomatic positions where I have something that's not justified that I have to start with. But when you bake on something like God or something that's it's like an entity. It's ontology. It has its own work that we have to do, right? When you tack that thing on, and it's entirely unjustified, everything else that you make in terms of your inferences and your investigation, it's already warped your thought process. You've already fucked up from the get. You could never say you would correct yourself if you truly held to that presupposition as this like fundamental axiom that you hold, right? Nothing, because like you would have to make the move of just arbitrarily changing it the same way that you arbitrarily set it in the first place. Because what would it matter? Listen, what would it matter for investigation if you didn't bothered for it in the first place to hold the view, right? I mean, just think about that.
Oh, I agree. But it's like Matt had talked about a lady one time that even when he broke it down and he made it perfectly clear that her beliefs didn't make any sense to follow, she chose to believe. She chose to rather believe than find out it was true, and that's what I'm talking about. If you don't recognize the intellectual flaw of what you're presupposing, you can't break out of it.
Right, and that's irrational and unreasonable to do that.
That's what people do every day. That's what people do every day.
But that's not an answer to my question. That's not. It's unreasonable and it's irrational to do those two things, which was the question. Is it irrational to presuppose a God? And we're saying no, and it sounds like you're agreeing to us, even though all three of us will agree that the people do this anyway. Just because people do it doesn't make it rational or reasonable.
It's reasonable because that's what the human being will do in a vacuum. The human will infer based on the information that's around him. We don't have the luxury of being in a vacuum. There's no such thing as an informational vacuum anymore.
I think we're talking past each other. It's not because you're saying it's reasonable to say that people will do this, and I agree that there's a chain of reasonable to get us to people do this, but to actually say it's reasonable to do it is a completely different thing, and that's what we're talking about. I think we're talking past each other because you keep.
Well, in the spirit of that, I do agree that it's not reasonable by your definition, right? It is not reasonable intellectually, but until you get to the point where you understand your flaw, because that's what people experience, breaking away from a religion, breaking away from a mindset, and once you identify that, the only point that I wanted to make is once you identify that what you are doing by looking at the way you've been brought up to believe something without being able to say, okay, this is false. How do I demonstrate that this is false when I can't demonstrate it's true?
Right, but presuppositionalists never do that. That's the problem with presuppositional apologetics. They don't ever do that, and because they start with that, the presupposition that there is a God, and that is their starting point. They don't get to it rationally, and that's what we're saying is unreasonable to do. Yeah. We're agreeing that people do it anyway because we have them call the show.
And that's why apologetics that works like it does, because it feasts on that. It needs that requirement to exist. That's why it makes a good starting point, because it's irrefutable at that level.
Not all apologists start with that presupposition.
But it is one that they start with, and that was you mentioned that, and I was just echoing.
Yeah. So yeah. Some do. But yeah, okay.
John, can I ask you one? Oh, sorry, Jim.
No, go ahead.
Just want to ask one last question and see if this might ring in a way. Because here's a problem that I have, especially is like you start with the presupposition of God. Okay. From that like initial kind of premise, doesn't it seem like any set of observations that you have on the world, like there's not going to be some set of observations that you have that isn't correspondent to that presupposition that you have, right? It seems like anything that you look out in the world from that presupposition, it's going to fit, right? Just automatically because you've already done
exactly.
That. So there's no what follows. Yeah, precisely. What follows is you have no way to adjudicate ones that would be out of accord with that entity, because any set of observations you could make the mental gymnastics to make it work. People do that with the Bible in general, right? They do that with scripture. Yep. That's the problem. One of the big problems I have with a God belief, especially in the religious realm, is that anything that I observe in the world or in the text, I could make it work for that God, right? It almost seems like nothing could prevent me.
That's because that's the way the human brain is tuned. That's because we seek information. We seek to confirm information. It's part of how we deal with things until we realize we're not doing it intellectually. I agree with you 100%.
Yeah. So we were talking past each other. We were you were using the word reasonable for slightly different than both Jmike and myself were. Because I think we were using it to be synonymous with rational, and you were using it as a process to get to a conclusion, I think.
And again, the only point that I wanted to use it to bring up was for somebody who's having that break point where they can't really separate one from the other, that once you realize that you're not looking at something in the right context with the right amount of information breakdown or investigative ability, that it's going to be hard to separate yourself from that, because I've experienced that myself.
So
right.
I guess for me, there seems to be an obfuscation there, because like I'm not concerned with the semantics of reasonable or rational. What I'm concerned with, is this a good method for truth? The answer is no, it's not.
No, it's not a good method for truth, and that wasn't the question.
So
I agree with you there.
Well,
right.
then
Okay.
I guess I don't really know why you would hold it then. That's just all I would have to say.
Well, I'm not sure that he's holding the position that it's a good place to start from. He's agreeing with it's a bad place to start from, but that people do start from there.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Sure.
All right.
Okay, yeah, maybe I'll have to go back and see what part I might have misheard you. That might be my bad as well.
All right. Thanks, John. Appreciate the call.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, it wasn't until I looked at the call screener's notes that he is an agnostic that I realized that we were probably talking past each other and tried to figure out how he's using the word reasonable.
It's all that too, but it was like then it was like, why would you in general hold this, or why would anybody hold this, or even advocate for it as a position to be
right,
rational towards truth? To me, is no, it's not. Whether you hold it or not, it's just across the board. I think it's a bad method.
Yeah, and he was agreeing to that. He was just using reasonable for different than we were.